Today, we're going to talk about crisis communications planning, and I'm going to cover a case study that involved a shipwreck, as well as the particulars of crisis planning itself and the guidelines for a crisis communications plan. This is the ship, the Costa Concordia, which was owned by Carnival, and it was actually twice as large as the Titanic. It held about 4,200 passengers plus crew members, and it was really state of the art at the time that it was built. The cruise that we're talking about is December of 2012, and so it was a holiday time cruise. A lot of people were on this ship with their families and friends, and they were there for the holidays to celebrate, being out of work and school. And this event happened at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the evening. This is the main entrance to this ship, this beautiful ship that was so state of the art and had everything you could want, a floating city on the sea. And this is where you would enter the ship as a passenger. Now, at the time of the incident, the lights went out when everybody was sitting at their seats in the dining rooms. The dining rooms are below decks, generally speaking, because when you're eating dinner, you can't see outside at night anyway. There's nothing to see because the ocean is completely dark. And so it's cozier to have dining rooms below decks where there aren't any windows. So all these people, thousands of people, were sitting in their dining room chairs, and they heard an impact. The ship had obviously hit something. And at the same time, they heard a tearing noise, and the lights went out. Now, when you're in a big room like that with thousands of people you don't know, and there is no announcement being made, the lights went out for about 20 seconds. It's a very uncomfortable feeling. At the same time, the engines stopped, and people in the dining room had the sensation that the ship was drifting. There were other people on the ship who were above decks, and they were at smaller restaurants or lounges where there was entertainment to be had. And one of the people in one of those venues was Rose Metcalf. She was a recent college graduate. She'd gotten her degree in kinesiology and dance. She's the one on the left in this picture. And she'd just gotten her BA and graduated from college. And then she had gotten this first job as a professional dancer aboard the Costa Concordia. She was actually on stage when the incident occurred, and she felt it all happen. And she immediately knew that it was an emergency situation. So she decided to leave the stage and go down to her stateroom so she could change her clothes and put on something more sensible. Many of the crew members have an assignment of passengers, approximately 10 or 15 passengers to each crew member, who they will be in charge of to load onto the lifeboats and make sure that they are all accounted for during an event like this. And so she felt a real responsibility to the 10 or 15 people she was going to be in charge of, and she decided to go in search of them. As she was leaving the stage, her supervisor actually told her to get back up on stage and continue dancing. And she respectfully said, "No, I'm afraid this is an emergency situation, and I need to go find the people I'm in charge of. I'm going to go get them on the lifeboats." So as she went downstairs to her stateroom to put on more sensible clothing, and then she went in search of the lifeboat area and her passengers. Unfortunately, by the time she got back up to the decks where she would be able to find the passengers and get down to the lifeboat deck, it was complete pandemonium. And the ship had already listed on its side to such a degree that the watertight doors had slammed shut. So she couldn't even get down the stairs to the lifeboat deck. It takes many, many really strong people to get one of those airtight doors to open once they've closed. And the whole point of that is that so that water can't spill from one deck to another, and hopefully it keeps the ship from sinking so fast. But in this case, it was keeping Rose from getting down to the lifeboat deck. And this is what the lifeboat deck looked like at that time. Now, this was complete pandemonium. There were about 30 different nations of people who were on this ship, and they had not prepared for this problem of not being able to communicate effectively. Now, if they had figured out what to do to communicate effectively, they would have probably assigned people who spoke each of the 30 languages of the guests on the ship, but they didn't do that. And so nobody was making announcements down here. No one was in charge. And to top it all off, they really didn't even, the crew members really didn't even know how to load the lifeboats the right way. So this is what was happening on the lifeboat deck. You can see the ship is keeled over, and they had lowered one of the lifeboats into the water, and the people were on the side of the ship going down a ladder instead of being loaded into the lifeboats and then being lowered into the ocean, as is what's meant to happen, because it keeps the passengers safer. At the same time this was going on, Rose was stuck well above this level in a much higher deck, and she had gathered about 10 people together, and they could not get to the lifeboat decks at all. So she started trying to figure out what to do. And it was decided nobody had a cell phone signal, so they couldn't call the Coast Guard. They couldn't call anyone on the land. So Rose decided, since she could get on Facebook, she decided to post something on Facebook. And she said, basically, this is Rose Metcalf. I'm on the Costa Concordia off the coast of Italy, on Giglio Island. We have run aground and the ship is sinking. We need help. I've got 10 passengers with me and we need to be rescued. We're on whatever deck they were on. And amazingly enough, pretty quickly thereafter, they saw helicopters above them. The helicopters were using their searchlights to find people who were stuck on the ship. And they couldn't see Rose and the other passengers. So they decided to open up their cell phones and turn on their flashlights or just light up their screens. And they waved them in the air. And the helicopter pilot actually saw the passengers. They sent down a ladder. The passengers, along with Rose, climbed the ladder into the sky and got into the helicopter, and they were actually rescued. So Rose saved 10 passengers and herself. And then most of the other passengers did eventually get rescued as well off of this ship, whether they were rescued in other ways or by boarding lifeboats in this manner that you see here. By the next morning, this is what the ship looked like really early in the morning. It was basically lying on the rocks against which it had run during that dinner time crash. And then by the next day, it had slid down those rocks and had become much more submerged, as you can see. Not only was this a disaster in the way of it being a terrible incident for all the people on board, but it was also just not handled well at all by the cruise line. And some of those ways they failed were that the crew members were not trained in the use of the lifeboats or in crowd control or in communication, as I mentioned earlier. There were these language barriers, and nobody was assigned to translate and interpret for the various language groups. It was astounding that the captain actually didn't ever send an SOS to the Coast Guard. And in fact, the passengers on the Costa Concordia called the Coast Guard themselves. So this eventually had a lot of repercussions legally, financially, and environmentally. And the outcomes were that there were 32 deaths in all. And the captain, Francesco Schettino, was sentenced to 5 years for causing the accident himself. I'll tell you about that in a minute. And 10 years for multiple counts of manslaughter and 1 year for abandoning ship while many were still on board, which is one of the most central pledges you make as a ship's captain, is that you will never abandon ship while you have passengers or crew aboard, and he did. On top of that, he caused the accident himself because he had a family member who lived on Giglio Island, and he wanted to be able to wave to them as they went by, and he would be standing on the on the bridge in the wheelhouse to wave to his family member. So he ordered the crew to take the ship as close to the island as possible. And what happened was it was a lot shallower there than they had predicted, and the ship was run aground and ripped a big hole in the side of the ship way down low underneath the waterline, which made the engines fail and immediately began the sinking process. This was one of the costliest maritime wrecks ever, and the recovery cost about $800 million, and that was an estimation of the lost property. In addition, there were overall insurance losses of more than $1.1 billion. And there was the potential for dire environmental consequences because of where the ship was run aground. And it languished there for 20 months with a lot of hazardous materials aboard, a lot of petroleum products, and everything on the ship was made virtually from petroleum products as well. All of the vinyl and all of the composite materials that made up the ship. So not only was all of this a terrible disaster, but then the entire incident was viewed with such poor eyes because there was such poor and misjudged communication. And what we want to do is avoid having the story become about the communication. That's the whole point of having a communications plan for crisis, because you want to avoid the poor or misjudged communication becoming the story. And in fact, the shipwreck survivors were so furious that they went on record as saying he told one lie after another to try and cover up what he had done. They're talking about the captain. He was not even raising the alarm to the authorities, and he was giving them untruthful indications. He didn't want to admit the real situation. And the damage to the reputation of the ship, the captain, and the cruise line didn't stop there. In fact, very soon after the shipwreck, American Express sent out this postcard to thousands of their customers, advertising a 7-night Mediterranean cruise from $749 for an ocean view or balcony stateroom on the Costa Concordia. And they even offered a $100 onboard credit per stateroom for using American Express and getting a card with them. The media coverage of this incident, as you can imagine, was pretty brutal, with the Daily Mail saying 7-night cruise through France, Italy, and Spain on the Costa Concordia, only $749. Embarrassment as American Express promotes trip on doomed liner. And to add insult to injury, the survivors were offered an additional 30% discount to go on another cruise. It says here, Carnival Corporation offers 30% discount to shipwrecked Costa Concordia passengers on future Costa cruises. Is this a sick joke? And as you can see, this CEO on the right, the picture of him is not good, and he was really besieged at this time. This is exactly what we try to avoid. So there are actually two sides to this kind of story, and they both affect all of us, whether we're in the business as professional communicators or not. And they are crisis planning and then crisis communications planning. So this is all about getting prepared for crisis scenarios. And you need to make sure that any organization you work for has done this. You want to make sure that the employees are trained. You want to make sure that outside agency assistance is already planned for. You want to know if you're the professional communicator, you want to know your local public information officer at the fire department and the police department. And you want to make sure that you have urgent care centers nearby with whom you have memoranda of understanding. So you can just send them anyone that needs to be treated, and then you can work out the payment plans later. This is something that big organizations like airports do, because it's really helpful to know you can just send somebody over there if they're experiencing a problem, and you can deal with all of the payment issues later. These two items on the right have to do with crisis communications, but they have to appear in the crisis plan as well as the crisis communications plan. So a main spokesperson needs to be identified, and you want to make sure you have one person to do that, because the media wants a single face for statements. And they want also separate recordings for video, for on-camera updates, and a second recording for audio radio, or podcast updates. And this is really important because we communicate differently whether we think people can see us or whether we know they can't see us. We speak differently when we know they can't see us. In addition, you need a dark site for use during emergencies only, and that site has to be stress tested and needs a very robust server. So for instance, in big crisis situations, thousands of people might go onto an organization's site and they crash the website. So you need a second dark site that you use only during emergencies. And now the next step is in preparation for communicating during crises. Your crisis communications plan starts with your objectives and key messages. And those messages will appear in pre-written emergency emails that are tailored specifically to each audience. You need to have a list of all of your audiences and the methods of contacting each of those audiences. So down to elected officials and board members, employees, stakeholders and investors, customers, vendors and suppliers, ancillary partners of any type, the public and the media. It's also a really good idea to have pre-written emergency tweets with the hashtags already figured out, because when you're under stress, you cannot come up with really good hashtags. And in fact, I've seen a couple of cases where public information officers were hired for the hashtags they used in crisis. And it's really unfortunate because if they had just prepared ahead of time, they could have avoided that. But sometimes hashtags can come off as being really insensitive. And so you have to be really careful and think those through ahead of time. The contact information for all key personnel and all of your audiences as well. And this contact information needs to be available to you whether or not you have electricity, a computer, or the ability to get into the office. So you need to have, if you are the communicator, you need to have a notebook where you have your contact information for all your key personnel in it, printed copies. And you need to have your entire crisis communications plan printed out and put in that notebook as well as the crisis plan itself. The plan that I was alluding to in the previous slide, where you're talking about, employee training, outside agency assistance. You want all this information in your notebook, and you take that with you. It's a good idea to have one in your car and one in your home, and then one in the office, so that you have it no matter where you are. And you need it whether you have electricity or not, whether you can get into the office or not. So what is our role in all of this? Well, first of all, we have to stay calm. The second objective is to listen as carefully as possible and gather as much information as you can. You don't want to jump to any conclusions, and you want to ask questions to evaluate ideas. And I'll talk about decision theory in just a minute. But one of the most important things we can do is to not make unconsidered or hasty decisions. And one of the tools that we can use in making decisions is decision theory. So you need to visualize what will happen if X is done, what will happen if X is not done. And one of the most effective methods I've had of doing this is to visualize or even draft a news release or news story based on what you think you're going to say, and then craft the headlines that could come out of that information. Make them as sensational as possible, because that's often what happens in crisis. Think about what's been happening with COVID-19 over the last couple of weeks and how sensational the headlines have been that you've seen in the news. It's really important to understand how the media works and how those headlines can affect your organization. Now, when crafting messages of any kind, it helps to keep in mind the kinds of information that the brain handles best. So some guidelines for responses would include that the information must be simplified and repetitive, emotion-based, and visual if at all possible. And note, I've put down 3 items here. The reason for that is that the power of 3 is very, very powerful. And people can remember 3 facts very easily. If you add more than 3, it becomes more challenging. So use the power of 3 in all of your communication, whether it's in marketing or in presenting information as, sort of a reporter role, or whether it's just when you craft emails, when you are teaching something. 3 is a very good number to use in the information that you provide. It's also a really good idea to understand the concerns that your executives will be preoccupied with. The first set of executive concerns are the financial impacts. And these could be losing sales or business, a lower stock value, lawsuits, legal fees, and judgments, regulatory fees. A lot of time is consumed or wasted during crises, and additional PR help or the resulting cost for repair and reputation of the company. Regarding the time consumed, I remember when I was working at a public agency in Orange County, and we had the Orange County bankruptcy. This was many years ago now, but at that time, all of our papers had to be gone through. Every single file had to be gone through because our paperwork was subpoenaed, and every single piece of paper that mentioned the retirement account with the county had to be presented to the court. Now, this was 60 years worth of paperwork, so they took every administrative assistant who worked for the agency and put them on the duty of going through all the files to find all of the paperwork that mentioned the retirement account. And then they had to hire temporary administrative assistants to do the work of the folks who had been taken away from their regular jobs. As you can imagine, this was extremely expensive. So in addition to, paying lawyers, there are all these kinds of fees in addition. So something to keep in mind. The second set of executive concerns has more to do with reputation impacts. But these are actually financial as well, because consider employee retention can be challenged, employee recruitment becomes more difficult, and loyalty is damaged. These actually have really severe financial repercussions in the long run. Also, loss of investor confidence could be a problem. The company might come under increased scrutiny, and the personal and career legal repercussions for the upper management is a very real concern. Now, next we're going to talk about the crisis communications commandments. These are basically, I think, 7 points that you need to keep in mind all the time. And these will help you actually create your crisis communications plan. So first of all, you're going to put the initial statement in writing. There should be no knee-jerk media conferences or interviews done without preparation. Of course, you're going to communicate only the truth and communicate it clearly, promptly, and preventatively in order to eliminate rumors and suppositions. That's a really disastrous thing that happens when you don't communicate enough or clearly or fast enough. You want to be fast, but you don't want to be hasty, so you need to be prepared before you communicate. Also, always maintain two-way communication with the public as well as the media and all the other audiences that are involved. You never want to speculate or guess about anything, and you never want to lay blame anywhere. This is reflected also, the blame issue is reflected in apologia theory, which was written out by Benoit, a really good PR thinker, and generally a good thinker in all the way around. The first 3 apologia points are things you do not want to do. There are 5 points, and the only acceptable ways to respond to a crisis are numbers 4 and 5. We'll get to those in a minute. Number 1 is denial. You never want to deny that the crisis happened, because obviously it did, and you will be found out. Number 2 is evasion of responsibility. You do not want to say that you were only responding because you'd been provoked. You don't want to say that it was just an accident. You don't want to say that you had good intentions, suggesting that you acted with good intentions, even though it was a negative outcome. That's evading responsibility. You also don't want to reduce the offensiveness of the crisis. You don't want to minimize it or try to focus on how your situation differs from a much worse act or make it look better than it is in any way. you do want to make reparations, that is, repair damages caused by the actions of the organization, as well as taking steps to prevent it from ever happening again. And you also want to do what they call mortification. Now, you've seen this happen a lot of times with professional athletes, where they get out in front of the media and they say, "This was terrible. I was doing something really wrong. I am so sorry. I hope my teammates, the public, and my fans can forgive me. And I am so sorry." So you admit the wrongful behavior, you ask for forgiveness, and you apologize. So these last 2 points are really important because you have to have the right kind of person to be able to say those things. And that would be an effective spokesperson. So the guidelines for an effective spokesperson are that they must be a sympathetic and likable character. They also need to be able to express emotion without breaking down. But above all, they cannot appear cold or unemotional. They also have to be willing to be trained. And then once they're trained, they have to be able to speak off the cuff while following soundbite guidelines. This is a really tall order. And it's also made more challenging because you have to have somebody who's senior enough in the organization that they'll be taken seriously. Now, generally speaking, the kind of person who becomes very successful as a CEO or a CFO is not the kind of person who is a very sympathetic kind of regular guy who could get out there and express really sympathetic emotions. So when you land on your feet at a new job, if you're the communicator at the organization, you should start looking for a likely spokesperson and see if you can maybe find the right person who has all of these characteristics. So if you ever find yourself in a crisis communications spot and you are the communicator, what should you do first? Well, first of all, you review your crisis communications plan, and then you sit down with the team that's involved in this. Usually that will be the CEO, maybe the chief marketing officer, maybe the chief financial officer as well, certainly the public relations person, that might be you, and anyone else at that level who usually the CEO wants along. And you want to summarize the known facts that everybody has gathered up. Then you want to update the messages and sound bites with the particulars of this particular crisis. And that means you go back in your crisis communications plan and you review the emails and tweets you've already crafted based on guesses about what might happen, and update those with the specific information based on this crisis that you are in. Then, if possible, you meet with in person the closest audiences, and if not, you communicate with them otherwise. And then you go out sort of in concentric rings from the closest out to the most distant audiences. This, of course, has to be kept in mind that depending on the circumstances, say you are the chief communicator for a mall and you have an active shooter incident, God forbid. The first thing you do, of course, is make sure that the mall is empty of people who could be harmed by the shooter. So that would be the first communication job. Hopefully that's not your job, because the crisis plan involves some other part of the organization, like operations, where they would be in charge of actually getting everybody out of the buildings. But you have to make sure to adjust your communications efforts based on the actual circumstances you're in. Then hopefully the spokesperson is in on the team that's summarizing the facts and updating the messaging. But if they're not, you'll want to then provide the spokesperson with updated sound bites and then remind them at that point to exhibit appropriate sentiment and emotion when they go out there to make the announcement to the media. And you want to be contacting the media to set up a press conference or a media announcement of some sort. And then you want to implement the rest of the communications plan, the crisis communications plan. So be sure to keep in touch with me. These are all of my social media profiles. I actually use LinkedIn most for students that I've presented to, and I'm pretty active on LinkedIn in general. A lot of the stuff that I produce, I'll post on LinkedIn. And I've actually have a group that I've formed there called the Developers and Builders Network for real estate developers and builders, because that's one of the niches I work in. And of course, remember that an effective crisis communications plan can help you avoid making the job you do the story the public hears about.